let's go ahead and start in with our introduction and our table of contents. Hi, I'm Rose.
And I'm Nico.
And this is Robot Elf Book Club. We read and discuss new science fiction and fantasy books. On this episode, we are discussing LEECH by Hiron Ennes, published by Tordotcom. It was released on September 22nd, 2022. We're going to talk a little bit about what happens in Act 1 and Act 2 of the book. We'll have a quick intermission, and then we will discuss the book's conclusion, and we'll hold any spoilers until that point of the recording. We'd like to start with a plot synopsis. Nico, if you have that in front of you now, would you favor us with a quick synopsis of this book?
This synopsis is from Goodreads, and it says, in an isolated chateau as far north as north goes, the Baron's doctor has died. The doctor's replacement has a mystery to solve, discovering how the Institute lost track of one of its many bodies. For hundreds of years, the Interprovincial Medical Institute has grown by taking root in young minds and shaping them into doctors, replacing every human practitioner of medicine. The Institute is here to help humanity, to cure and to cut, to cradle and protect the species from the apocalyptic horrors their ancestors unleashed. In the frozen north, the Institute's body will discover a competitor for its rung at the top of the evolutionary ladder. A parasite is spreading through the Baron's castle, already a dark pit of secrets, lies, violence, and fear. The two will make war on the battlefield of the body. Whichever wins, humanity will lose again. So reading that now, I can see how that describes the book, but that does not give me the impression of the book that I think that does not really describe what I
It doesn't really feel like that was the conflict. Yeah.
And
I mean, there was a conflict between the parasites, but
I feel like that was almost a better description of the Institute than the book itself gave me.
Yeah.
Because it has grown by taking root in young minds and shaping them into doctors. Little do you know. Wow. Little do you know, it's actually going to take over your brain like the brain slugs from Futurama.
Well, this is the book that has an interesting twist on the age-old question, what's worse than opening up your doctor and finding a worm?
I don't know that I've ever had that question.
The answer is opening up your doctor and finding 2 worms.
Well, no, that's actually really good for this book, isn't it? Bravo.
Yeah,
okay.
gosh, it's been a while since we started on this book. Do you remember sort of what your hopes or fears or expectations were before you went in?
Well, I remember I read this description and didn't process any of it. And I remember thinking it was going to be like a Victorian setting, kind of Frankenstein-esque is the first thing you think of when you think of Victorian manners and whatever. I thought it'd be a fitting book for us to read during a pandemic because there's the whole Covidiceps concept that has been thrown around on the internet of how cordyceps is a fungus parasite that takes over the brains of insects and stuff to force it to replicate. And then there's this concept that maybe COVID is doing the same thing and getting people to take risk-taking behaviors to spread it. So Covidiceps has come out of that. And it's parasites they're spreading. This is going to be a great book for Halloween during a pandemic. And then the reviews mentioned that it was not for the weak stomach and had weird elements. And I was like, but it also kind of sounds a bit like Bloodborne, which is a video game set in a Victorian setting. And I don't know that there's anything weirder than Bloodborne. Because the good ending for Bloodborne is where you turn into a slug, and that's the good ending. And it's okay. So let's see what this has in store for us. And then about 50% in, I changed my impression to, well, maybe I should call this Doctor Who Transylvania. And I don't know that any of it is accurate, but those are my impressions. And then this ended up being something of its own.
Yeah, it really was. It really was pretty unique. I just like to read spooky stuff this time of year. The leaves start falling off the trees and the days get shorter, and I just want to curl up with a cup of tea and read a spooky book. So that's what I wanted, and I feel like it delivered. It is pretty gory. So if you have a weak stomach and a powerful imagination, maybe not for you.
I would almost say it's like a sterile gore, though, which is like an odd way of saying it, but it's like medical gore. Because the author is apparently an actual doctor, and so with surgery experience. And so the things that are described in this book are very, very accurate and no holds barred as to what bits are coming out of where. And there's a lot of discussion about black goop that's got tendrils that's reaching around and trying to get behind your eyeballs and stuff. So it's a little squeamish in that way, but I don't know that it's like, torture porn gore.
No,
over the top.
The language,
it's all perfectly like reasonable. The way things are described, it just doesn't hold any punches.
Yeah, it's very clinical.
Yeah, that's the word, not sterile. It's clinical.
It helps put a little bit of a barrier between the reader and the material, I think, for me anyway, being a non-medical professional, being someone who has fainted at the sight of blood before.
And then I've worked in veterinary medicine, and I was always just amazed at how they would pull that red thing out of the animal and be like, oh, nope, that's not it, and just shove it back in. I was like, how do you know which thing that was? They all look exactly the same. And then like, oh, here it is. I was like, how did you know? It looks exactly the same as all the other red things. So this book was all like, and there's a lot of medical terminology in this book that I found familiar coming from a veterinary setting as well. So if you're familiar with medical settings, you might enjoy this book.
And just interesting use of language in general. And I do want to come back to the list of interesting vocabulary words that you made in your notes because they're so fantastic. We'll go ahead and dive into the plot now. And I found it really difficult to outline this because there's a lot going on in the beginning of the book. So we know from reading our plot synopsis that our doctor is a parasitical organism basically, and it's inhabiting a host body. And so I want to put that out there because I kind of like that gets lost in all of the details that kind of come through in the first couple of chapters. So we know that the doctor is a parasite, right? And when the book opens, our doctor is en route to a remote northern village on a train. And the doctor's on the way to replace the previous doctor of the local baron who passed away under mysterious circumstances. The doctor died, not the baron. The baron is apparently 500 years old and very ill, but also like mean enough to live another 500 years. I'm exaggerating, but
my description for the baron was Jabba the asshole. That's the description I got from it.
He's a mean old man full of piss and vinegar. We get some interesting facts about the doctor. They're very small of stature. The doctor trades gloves with a child who they see on the train who has sort of chewed the finger of their glove out. And so we know the doctor has small enough hands that they can trade gloves with the child. And when the train stops, the doctor meets up with Baker, one of the local denizens. He is a demolitions expert and a mechanic. The doctor has an interesting familiarity with the town and the people living there, even though this is their first visit. Baker drops the doctor off basically at this massive Gothic mansion, the chateau. Beats feet, gets out of there. We meet at the chateau. We meet Didier, the Baron's adult son, and the houseboy, Emile. Emile is mute, does not speak. The doctor wants to get right down to business and perform an autopsy on the body of the previous deceased doctor. The death was apparently caused by a lancet to the neck. They believe it to have been a suicide. And the new doctor extracts a disgusting organism from the eye socket of the deceased doctor and has the doctor's corpse incinerated to prevent the spread of infection. We will come back to this. So, and then the organism that the new doctor finds in the old doctor's eye is like described as like being like this mass of like black tentacles and like hair-like things, and keeps it in a specimen jar. I think it's gross. It's nasty. And throughout this first part of the book, the doctor's hearing from other voices with whom they're in communication. And the voices are kind of, chiming in at the discovery of this organism. And here is a quote that I wrote down from the book. It says, "Voices spell out caution and curiosity in equal measure. Some propose the hair-like processes are fungal hyphae. Others suggest tactile flagella, and still others are unsure, turning the pages of 1,000 biological texts as they scoured the breadth of my knowledge. All, however, spiral toward a similar terrifying conclusion. It appears I have a competitor."
That was such a great end to that chapter, too. Like, this book as a whole has a really great use of hooks and cliffhangers. Like, it really turns into a page turner.
Yeah, especially in the last maybe 20 to 30%. It was really hard to put down, and just really effective use of propelling the narrative forward. It was really fantastic. I want to talk a little bit about the chateau and the environs of Verdura and their inhabitants.
I actually want to go back to the network, the doctor's parasitic network. So the reason the doctor's hearing voices from the air, basically, is because this parasite, the Institute, has taken over bodies across the globe, basically. And it's all interconnected, which is a really interesting premise for this, because they're doctors, right? So what a doctor is an algorithm, basically. An algorithm and an encyclopedia of medical knowledge. So they can take symptoms, they can diagnose it by using their knowledge and putting all the clues together, basically, right? So this use of that is like having an always-on internet in the doctor's brain at all times. So you don't have to go look anything up. You just collective knowledge of crowdsourced knowledge, basically. This is what that symptom could be. Oh, I agree. It's like having an entire hospital of doctors in the brain of your doctor. And that sounds so efficient to me. Like, that's incredible. And so this doctor has taken over, or this parasite has taken over the role of all the doctors on the earth, basically, because it's found this niche that it can fill and be useful. But it's also taking over people's bodies. So we'll get to that a little bit later. But
right.
Just as a premise for this book, though, it struck me as a little bit of like Sherlock Holmes. It's a doctor who's trying to solve mysteries, but it's got this extra advantage of having the network that's kind of feeding into how it can solve those, how it can make those deductions. So having that as almost like a superpower really helps to set the stage for the things that the doctor can do, which I thought was really cool.
Mm-hmm. There does seem to be an element of proximity involved with how far the doctor is able to communicate with its other hosts.
Yeah, I was not clear on that, because there were a couple points where the doctor was like going into a mine, stuff like that, and it's saying like, oh, I can't hear them very well, but I wasn't clear if that was like because the rocks were blocking it, or if there was something weird going on with the chateau that was blocking it, or if its encounters with the other parasite they were about to talk about might have had something to do with that, or if that's just an expected result of distance. So it wasn't entirely explained how that network works, but I still thought it was interesting. Yeah, there was as a premise
a little bit of mystery there as to whether or not they were losing contact due to environmental factors, or if it was the action of the other parasite.
I think I even highlighted something in my book and wrote, "What is the range of this?" But
to talk a little bit about the dramatis personae, we have the Baron. who I've already talked about. He's 1,000,000 years old and in ill health, but mean enough to keep on kicking for another 100 years. We have Didier, his disappointment of an adult son. We have Helene, Didier's miserable wife, eternally pregnant. She has mostly failed to actually produce any living offspring, with the exception of the twins. 2 girls. I believe they're about age 10. I can't remember if it said specifically what their age was in the book. They have a mysterious link with each other, which sort of goes beyond just like the normal, like twin shared language type stuff that you would typically see in a work of fiction. For example, if you give medication to one, the other one is affected by it as well.
There's a lot of descriptions of how they breathe, and one inhales and the other exhales, like in rhythm.
Yeah.
And I spent most of the book under the impression that they were Siamese twins, because it talks about how they're attached at the temples, but you seem to think that meant that their hair was tangled together.
Right. Yeah. So the defining physical trait of these girls is that they both have these heads of wild, dark hair that they've had since they were born. And I believe that is how they are connected or have been connected. Their hair just gets tangled up and they're always like so close together until the end. We'll get to that.
Because that's what really threw me. It was like, they're not connected anymore, but I thought they were Siamese twins. Oh, what did I misunderstand here? So
yeah. I think you're definitely led to sort of believe that they do have some weird metaphysical connection with each other. There is also a priest, the local folk healer. He has kind of been displaced by the Institute's doctor, but he seems to be pretty good-natured about it all. He tells a lot of stories throughout the book. He spent a lot of time with the sort of the indigenous population, which are known as the Montish people. This is a post-apocalyptic story, and we'll talk a little bit more about the environment and the setting. But my understanding is that the local population of people were they lived in caves for a long time. There was, this big, disaster, and humanity, civilization kind of crumbles, and humanity goes into hiding for a long time and slowly kind of reemerges and rebuilds civilization. And so the Montish people are the people who are local to this area. And Priest has spent a lot of time with them and sort of gathering up their myths and legends and stuff. One of the stories that he tells kind of throughout the book is the story of a little girl who grows into a woman. Her name is Utali. And she is a girl who grew up as a playmate of Didier when they were children. And as they grow older, he sort of becomes infatuated with her. We'll get into that a little bit more as the story goes on.
And Utali also has a tail. And
she has a tail, yes.
The doctor describes how vestigial tails are not that uncommon, and some of its bodies have them as well. So that's like something that in the years since Earth was what we know it as now, this seems to have become more common. It is common. That's why we have a tailbone. It is common to have like a vestigial tail, but Utali's tail is described as like a prehensile tail. She's able to wrap it around people and hold on to things. And I was like, that is not what prehensile or vestigial tails are like.
Yeah,
so,
it's like a whole ass tail. She has a whole ass tail. So it's an important detail. The linchpin of the local economy of Radira is a wheat rock mine, which is exploited by the Baron and his family. And their employees are the local Montish folk primarily, but they also import workers when needed, when cave-ins and things like that happen in the mine, as rich people are wont to do. And we are given to understand that a recent mine collapse in the wheat rock mine had prompted the previous doctor to investigate shortly before the onset of his mysterious illness that ended in his apparent suicide. The new doctor is cautioned against leaving the chateau due to the miserable winter conditions and the presence of dangerous Ventigo, which are interesting creatures we'll talk about here. And despite those warnings, our doctor has Emil hitch up the sled with the sled dogs, and they venture out to the scene of the collapse. I do want to sideline here to talk a little bit about the Ventigo.
But not the wheat rock? Because that's what I want to know more
We'll
about.
talk about the wheat rock, too. What the hell is wheat rock?
What the hell are Ventigo?
Yeah, did you? I know that we talked a little bit about this in email. You had kind of some thoughts.
Did I have thoughts? What did I say? That was a while ago now.
The
Ventigo.
You said that they reminded you of let's see.
I said they reminded me a bit of Year Walk, but only sort of peripherally, because like the cover of the Year Walk game has like an elk skull or something on a creepy one or thing. And the Ventigo are described as like tall white elk with glowing red eyes, but they like stand on bipedally, and they have like really sharp claws, and they like slash. They can slash with their claws, and they seem very hostile and aggressive. But there are some notes in some offhanded comments in the book that suggest that dogs will keep them at bay, and that they will only come out at night and only in winter. So all summer you are safe from these, but because they're up in the far north, it's actually really cold early. So these things are already coming out.
And they only like open spaces. They won't go anywhere where there's a roof. So
Yes.
As long as you're inside, you're fine. You're totally fine.
If they can't see the sky, they won't come out or something.
Yeah, that's like the saying of the local folks. I found these really fascinating. They weren't a huge factor in the book, but I just was so interested by this. They're like enormous cryptids, right? Well, I guess people see them, so maybe they're not cryptids, but they're described as having antlers sharp as knives and breath as terrible as the iciest storms.
And they have been described a couple times in the book as they scream and icy cold air like blasts out. It's almost like a ice breath kind of thing.
Yeah, like an ice, like a storm breath, or some kind of crazy attack. They're known to kill humans and dismember the corpses, but they don't consume them. And here's another quote. It says, they scatter and rearrange the blood-stained smears of viscera, then do so again and again, as if searching for something. And Utali tells Didier a legend from her people about the origin of the Ventigo. They descend from a Montish man who longed to reach the stars so much that he climbed the highest hill he could find and stayed there, stretching up to the stars until he died. She characterizes these monsters as a spirit of longing.
Oh, here's another quote from the book that says, the first Ventigo had been a man once. What does that mean?
And I thought it was also interesting. There's sort of as the doctor begins to have memories of their host body, there are some childhood memories that the body has about fears concerning flight. So she has this memory. Every machine that flies ultimately flies to kill, whether its builders intended it to or not. Is one of their childhood memories. And the doctor, while still inhabited by the parasite, says, it would not surprise me to learn that the Ventigo are like the starlings of Inultis, biological mistakes birthed by millennia of reckless experimentation, human or otherwise. It is impossible to settle the Ventigo safely into any taxonomic niche, even among ungulates. It is an orphan, like the Inultan starlings, like androids of myth, like Pseudomycota, like me. Perhaps that is why it devours as it does, endlessly searching for itself, abandoned by the hand that created it. I do think longing is the right word for it. Longing, perhaps, or emptiness. I found this all just really interesting because to my ear, the word Ventigo sounds a lot like Wendigo or Windigo, which is a First Nations myth. It's thought to be like a curse that can befall a human, where they get this need to engage in cannibalism, or just destructive behavior, destructive toward the environment, just like just this insatiable like greed. And I thought that lined up really well with the description of the Ventigo, how they, they murder like humans and they tear them apart, but they don't seem to find what they're looking for. And that also made me really feel like this story was set in North America specifically.
Oh, see, I felt it was set in France.
Yeah. See, I was gonna ask you about that a little bit. Like what led you to think that? The thing that threw me off is the fact that the people do seem to be speaking a descendant of French. Mm-hmm. And I was like, how would that happen if they were in North America? Like they'd have to go pretty far east to be in like Quebec. Mm-hmm. So I don't know exactly, but just that specific detail. Also the wine, the ancient wine they're drinking being from Cascade Hills Winery.
I did a search for Cascade Hills Winery and I could not find a Cascade Hills Winery. There was a Cascade something in Washington, but it wasn't Cascade Hills.
Cascade Cliffs. Yeah. I looked it up too. The author of this book apparently is local to the Pacific Northwest somewhere. I don't know exactly where. And
maybe it's supposed to be frozen north because Canada and we speak French up here. Mm-hmm. That would make sense too. I just assumed it was France because all the words were like a mixture of French. So, but I forgot that we speak French in Canada too. Even though it's on all of my cereal boxes and stuff.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Do you remember anywhere in the book them mentioning any animals other than sled dogs and Ventigo, though? Did they have birds? Like you just mentioned starlings, which made me remember
starlings.
That.
Yeah, there are like these starlings that are endemic to the area where the Dr. Host body grew up. I guess they. I don't think they talked about them extensively, but they're like these massive flocks of starlings that.
Okay, so there are birds then.
Yeah, there are birds.
Because this location is supposed to be like so far north and so remote and like so frozen right now that they don't really describe any other wildlife. But I was wondering if the Ventigo are out there like killing all the wildlife and that's why it was so dead, or is it just because it's winter? Oh. And so I was curious about that. And there were, maybe this is more spoilery, but there was some interviews with the author where he was asked about the Ventigo, and there were some allusions that it sounds like it wasn't really planned out, but the author was the sense that the author themselves got from it was that the Ventigo might have been some sort of bioengineering project from before the apocalypse that has now kind of gone off the rails and has, because there's no one overseeing it anymore. It got out of its labs and now it's kind of doing its thing out there. But so there's a lot more to this world building that we don't know, which is really fascinating too.
Yeah, it was obviously pretty well thought out. I mean, despite the fact that the author didn't say definitively what the Ventigo was or where it came from. Yeah, it's just really interesting that the dogs, the sled dogs, were said to have been descended from dogs that it essentially went feral after civilization collapsed. Like all the dogs like fled into the wilderness and became like savage and vicious again. So these sled dogs they're not like good doggos, 10 puppers. They're pretty vicious dogs.
No, most sled dogs are essentially feral. Like they're not pets. They are working dogs, and you're not supposed to like interact with them in a loving manner most of the time. That's probably what a lot of dog handlers say, so they don't have to, so they can get away with abusing their animals, probably. Oh. Probably not in modern day, I should say. That comes from a lot of like early 1900s stories I've read, so.
Yeah. Oh, don't put that thought in my head.
Sorry. But like, I didn't, not like abuse as in like abuse, but like as in, okay, you have to sleep out in the cold. I'm not going to be next to you because you're just here to do a job for me. The typical objectification of workers.
Yeah. There's a lot of that going on. To get back to the plot. Emil, the houseboy, and the doctor are at the mine. They go down the passage, and they discover masses and masses of this awful, slimy, black growth with the tendrils and the hairs and stuff, similar to what was in the deceased doctor's eye socket. Our doctor attempts to gather a sample, but the organism like twists around and stings the doctor's hand. The doctor drops it and is like, I got to get out of here. This was a terrible idea. And like grabs the meal and they run out of the mine to the surface. This messed up tentacle thing follows them out onto the surface. It's propelling itself through the snow, like flopping through the snow, beelining toward the doctor like it's on a mission, right? Like flop, flop, flop. The lead sled dog, because she's a very good girl, pounces on this thing, snaps it up in her jaws, and swallows it.
Gross.
Dun, dun, dun. So at this point, they're in the ice and snow. The dog has something bad going on. I'm very much thinking about The Thing at this point.
Yeah, that was my first thought as well. Because like the thing opens with them chasing a sled dog across the snow because it's got an organism in it. And it's like,
why is this guy shooting at the dog? Let's, leave the dog alone. No, they were right to shoot the dog. Okay, so they head back to the chateau. The doctor, lets Emil take the dogs back to the kennel and, takes the sample and, is not feeling very great, sleeps it off. And the next day, the doctor has a nightmare about the dog, like throwing up the organism, right? And realizes
they tried to kill it too in the tunnel, and it would not die. So the doctor realizes, okay, that thing got swallowed by the dog. I am an idiot for thinking that the digestive tract of the dog is going to kill that thing. Holy shit, it's in the dog. It's going to come back out. We have to go deal with this right now.
We have to deal with this right now. We have to get the dog. We have to, euthanize the dog. We got to do an autopsy, whatever, we got to deal with this. So goes down to the kennel to try and get it worked out. Finds Didier down there yelling at Emil. And being an asshole. It turns out that the lead dog is not in the kennel. It seems like Emil has let her loose because he loves the dogs. He knew the doctor was going to come and like kill the dog. So just, let the door open and let the dog out into the snow. Surprise. They call the constable and they're like, you need to form a search party. You need to go out and, find this dog. You need to kill this dog. It's going to spread disease. And the doctor has a meeting with Didier about the mine, and says, we've got more, I've sent for more institute personnel to come and investigate. And the doctor says we should quarantine the mine until spring. And I highlighted this part of the book because I thought it was a little bit too real. Didier says, no, I want a sensible response. You can't just shut everything down. That's a terrible idea. It's the only source of wheat rock we have. The health of Verdera is at stake, I say, says the doctor. The health of Verdera is forfeit if we cut off our livelihood, says Didier. So the Center for Not Disrupting Capitalism is active in this post-apocalyptic scenario. We can't shut off the wheat rock mine. Nico, what the hell is wheat rock?
I really wish I knew. It's a rock that you can eat, apparently. Do you happen to know if the author was writing this book before the pandemic, or is this purely a pandemic result?
I don't know. I get this sense that it's been a work in progress for quite some time.
But there could have been some elements that they went back and revised and added in, for sure.
It definitely could have been influenced by current events, I think, yes.
So is this mine the only source of wheat rock? Because if they shut it down, is it for the entire planet or for this region?
See, that I don't know. It might be only for that region. It might be the only source of wheat rock that that the Barron's family has access to to exploit.
Because my impression of the wheat rock was that, so the apocalypse happened, everybody had to hide in the caves, and they were eating the wheat rock in the caves.
Mm-hmm.
And now that they are back out of the caves, they can use the wheat rock to seed barley and wheat and all kinds of other things, or they can just eat it straight. Or is it the wheat rock that seeds the barley? Because they talk about the dog's noses falling from the sky, which I initially thought were meteors. And I was like, what the fuck? But then it turns out they're actually tiny little spaceships, which makes a lot more sense. But the dog's noses fall from the sky, and that seeds fields. And it turns out that those are actually spaceships that were in orbit, that they sent the ships up into orbit to escape the apocalypse. And presumably they sent them up there with lots of seeds and all sorts of things to reseed the Earth once everything had settled down. I don't think we ever talked about what the apocalypse is. So the moon has broken. The moon is now just a shard of the moon up there. And so parts of the moon came down and kind of fucked everything up. And so they sent some ships into space with seeds and I'm assuming stuff to reseed the Earth. And then things obviously went wrong because there's nobody alive up there as far as we know. And those ships' orbits are now decaying and falling back down. So you have these meteor showers of what they call dog's noses because the ships look like dog's noses. The form of the engines forms the same kind of shape as a dog nose. And then they say that seeds the Earth and gives them crops. But is that wheat rock? Or is that just wheat and barley seeds? I was not clear on any of this.
Yeah, I kind of got the impression that wheat rock is a substance that can be processed to become edible. Is not necessarily something that you would want to just eat straight out of the earth. It may be a bioengineered substance. Or it may be, something that just sort of randomly mutated, after, I don't know. There's a lot of suggestions that science really went off the rails before civilization collapsed, perhaps causing civilization to collapse. There's a detail in the book about a ring made of compressed wheat rock.
Yeah, ring. I don't understand wheat rock at all.
Yeah. So they say the ring had an emerald on it, which was composed of compressed wheat rock. And so I immediately go to Wikipedia. What is emerald composed of? It's made of beryl. So it can't possibly be the fact that they're eating a mineral, right? They're calling this an emerald, and it's not an emerald the way we would understand an emerald to be. I don't know.
It makes sense if it's green and see-through. You'd be like, oh, it's an emerald, and the wheat rock is green. So I would say it's not beryl, but it can be compressed to the point where it becomes a solid crystal.
They talk a little bit about jade too. Jade being something that they work with and harvest and stuff like that. And that made me specifically think of British Columbia, actually. Again, placing this in what is now North America. There was an awesome line in here about the seasons that they experience. There's like meteor season and acid rain season, and
yeah, it's pretty clear that the Earth is fucked. But it's less fucked than it was when we had to be underground, apparently.
We can just go to the fume waste, says Helen. That sounds like a charming place to vacation, right? I can't find the line about the seasons now, but it was great. So what the hell is wheat rock? We don't really know what wheat rock is, but it's an important resource. They need it to eat. And they can't possibly shut down the mine.
It makes sense if we knew the Earth was about to be destroyed for 1,000 years or whatever, to create some sort of very versatile nutrient substance. Like in sci-fi, you often have like nutrient paste or something, and it's just like this disgusting but very fulfilling paste that tastes horrible, but it gives you all the nutrients you need. And so nutrients
and calories, and specifically a substance that can be propagated underground.
Yeah. And
If
so
the
if it
surface of
doesn't
the earth
need
is a very hostile place, yeah.
being able to grow wheat rocks without needing solar power would be very important for surviving underground or surviving in space even. So yeah, it would make sense that that was some sort of engineered response to the moon exploding and destroying the world.
Yeah.
If they had time to engineer it anyway.
Okay, so Diddy obviously is not going to cooperate with the doctor's plan. The doctor is really intent on putting a halt to this invading parasite that seems to really have it in for them. And so the doctor gets together with Baker, our local demolitions expert, to convince him to collapse the mine in order to close it off. Baker is not an idiot. He doesn't want to, go against the Baron in that way. He's like, have you seen what that guy does to people who cross him? He shoots their knees out. And so the doctor lies to Baker in order to get him to cooperate and spin some story about Baker had been sweet on some gal that got killed in the mine collapse. And says, "Oh, it was this thing. It was this virus, this parasite that killed the woman that you loved." And so Baker agrees to make some explosives to blow up the mine. And while the doctor is there, they also service Baker's artificial heart. This was kind of a gross scene. The doctor has brought some scavenged plastic tubing. Apparently there are plastifhages in this world, so it's really hard to get plastic from the old world.
Which makes sense. And we're already finding bacteria that's evolving to eat all the plastic we're leaving in the ocean. So 1,000 years from now, it makes total sense that bacteria have evolved to the point where they're using it as a food source.
Yeah. But in the meantime, Baker gets some fresh plastic for his heart. The doctor happens to notice that the blood on the tube is black and just says, "Oh, that's weird."
I was reading that and I was like, so blood should basically never be black. If it's like dark brown, then okay, it's kind of old, it's dried out. That's not great, but fresh blood should not be black. So what the fuck is going on with this heart? Like what it's weird enough that you have a plastic heart that is fueled by tubes, like plastic tube energy. But the blood in it is black. What the fuck is going on here?
That was just such a weird scene, and how he's got this, like, Baker has this valve on his chest. And
it was very Iron Man like, right? He just kind of like twisted the thing on his chest and pulled out the tube, and Baker's just dead. And then he puts it back in.
He's just laying there on the floor. I was getting this image of the doctor, like, pulling the tube and like getting him started, like starting a lawnmower. So that was really interesting. I was like, are there more people that are like cyborgs like this? This is weird. The doctor seems to be sort of losing contact with its other minds at this point more and more, having more difficulty communicating with them and hearing a different voice, which it can't identify. It thinks, "Oh, that's strange." Obviously, as the reader, you're thinking this is your host body's voice, speaking and having memories. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here and get to the point where Baker's house explodes. Kablooey. The whole thing is gone. The doctor is horrified. The doctor's in the chateau when this happens and, runs out across the snow, like, just has to know what's happening. The entire house is just gone. All the explosives are gone. Baker's remains are there. And the doctor discovers at that point that Baker had been infected with pseudomycota. And it seems like the doctor's in kind of a bad space right now because they're really wanting to kind of contain this alien, this invading organism, and they can't shut the mine down at this point. And the trains have not been running because winter has come and it's snowy and the trains can't run in the snow and whatever. They're cut off. They're cut off from the rest of the institute.
They clearly needed the train from Snowpiercer.
Yeah, they needed that train. So
Baker had told the doctor that the previous doctor had mentioned his name was Stanislas.
Mm-hmm.
And this doctor was like, wait a minute. Those doctors are part of my institute parasitic organism and we forsake our names. Why would that doctor have mentioned a name to Baker? This is very curious.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, this doctor starts menstruating, which is something that should not happen because the body has been chemically castrated. And so something crazy is going on with this parasite, the institute parasite, because the doctor's starting to lose contact with the network of doctors in the institute, and the body's starting to regain its original characteristics, including potentially the name or menstruation abilities. So something wacky is going on in the doctor's world.
Yeah, and the doctor, anytime the doctor is asked for a name, they respond with service over self. Service over self. And so people say, well, okay, service. Yeah, so the doctor is also not sleeping well, feeling very paranoid, understandably paranoid. The twins get sick. They're not looking good at all. They have black snot coming out of their noses.
Snot should not be black.
It should not be black.
You are a doctor and you didn't remark on the black blood in the heart and the black snot. And I was like, what the fuck is going on?
Everything was so messed up. I mean, I don't know how you pick out like the stuff that's more messed up out of the stuff that's less messed up. I don't know. But so Helen is really upset. The doctor sedates the twins so they can rest. Helen is pregnant again. She's pregnant a lot. Not very hopeful about the outcome because she's had enough mishaps that she's just expecting the worst basically.
And drinking heavily while pregnant, which probably is not helping.
Drinking heavily, yeah. And I was reading that scene and I didn't think much of it until she gets to the point where she's like basically forcing the maid to, give the doctor a drink and won't accept no for an answer. And it's like, wait a minute, she's pregnant. Like she shouldn't be drinking all of this booze. But yeah, and she's just, she's so miserable. She's so miserable. She's, she knows that her husband doesn't really love her and, she kind of doesn't really feel like she has much to live for, but she's very upset about her daughters being ill because, those are her living children. The next day, she apparently goes into labor, which is very stressful. She's not to the point where her baby would be done cooking. So they're basically like, okay, well, let's get this done with. She complains that she's so cold and she's like wanting to, be right up against the fireplace, like right up against the fireplace grate.
Well, that's something we didn't mention too, is that this winter seems bitterly cold. Like it's normally very cold in the winter, but everyone's remarking on just how cold it is this winter. It's just remarkably cold.
It's like how miserably cold it is, and at all times, and everyone's bundling up, and so the doctor delivers her baby, which turns out it seems to be a fully formed and healthy infant, to the shock of everyone. They send Diddy out of the room with his son, his newborn son. Helen is, after she's finished with her labor. She's complaining that she has this terrible headache. She's got this pain behind her eyes. She's been complaining about having a boil. She's, and the doctor, hasn't been able to find anything wrong with her. Long story short, she ends up vomiting up a pseudomycota and she dies. The doctor's like trying to kill the pseudomycota. I would like trying to beat it with a fireplace poker or something like that. It's very resilient. The doctor wants to burn it. But Emil, who's there because he's basically the only person in the house who's useful, stops the doctor from burning the organism. And so the doctor does some, poor Helene, they mourn her quickly. And the doctor does some more experimentation with the samples that they've taken. And the doctor realizes, sort of after spitefully burning it in the fire, that the being burned in the fire transforms the organism to an airborne state where it then propagates itself. And so when the doctor insisted that the old doctor's corpse be burned, they infected the whole house, basically. Oopsie. Did I do that? So that's why everyone is so cold, is because the organism wants the host to be close to the fire so it can, propagate itself, which is also sort of a bad sign, I guess, that when Baker was infected, because Baker's house exploded, that it may also have been, that may have been manipulated by pseudomycota if it was sentient. We'll talk about that, because it would blow itself up and go up into the air, and go out into Verdera. Everyone seems to have been infected except Emil, whom the doctor, spies one evening, at the window, desperately trying to cool down because it's so unbearably hot in the chateau. And so the doctor comes up with this brilliant idea. The doctor realizes that, it's been infected, that it's losing contact with the institute because it's been infected because this the parasite is sort of cutting it off, and decides that in an effort to preserve itself, it's going to infect Emil with itself, and make Emil into a host body.
It's kind of a Hail Mary on the doctor's part, because at this point, the doctor's not really sure if the rest of its bodies are still alive either, because it can't contact any of them. So it knows that its current body is doomed. It's been infected by the pseudomycota. So it's like, okay, Emil can't be infected. I'm going to colonize Emil, and then I will have at least one body that is safe from pseudomycota.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because this one is done for, basically. And so the doctor, invites Emil to their suite, and gives him a nice warm drink. Go ahead, have some. It's good. But the doctor's like having like the second voice in the doctor's head is like, don't do this. This is awful. This is wrong. You can't do this. But the doctor, does it anyway. So Emil is, paralyzed, and the doctor, drags Emil, onto the bed and discovers that Emil has these burns on his chest that look like the fireplace grate. They have like the leaves from the fireplace grate. And the doctor injects an ampule of itself into Emil. And then goes to take dinner with the Baron, I think, while waiting for Emil to be, what is the word that the doctor used?
I would say colonized.
Colonize is
Like,
probably a good one.
I don't know if that's the word you'd use for a parasite necessarily, but it's the word you would use for a fungus, which is
Yeah, there was a specific term that the doctor like it wasn't converted, but it's just something along those lines. Yeah, colonize is a good one. While at dinner with the Baron, this was the weird part of the book for me, and I didn't really understand what was going on until I got further in and learned more about the doctor's host body, or their original host body. But the doctor starts sort of hallucinating Emil's memories, and learns that Didier has been abusing Emil. Out of this like unresolved longing for Utali, who had been Emil's mother. Emil also has a tail like Utali did, so I think that's probably what triggered it. The new doctor also learns that Emil was present during the death of the previous doctor, Stanislaus. The old doctor had told Emil, "Don't trust anyone without a name," just before dying. Emil is resistant to the Institute in the same way that Emil is resistant to pseudomycosis. So the Institute is not able to successfully colonize him, but the doctor does sort of have this link with Emil from this point on in the book.
Which is very convenient for plot purposes, but it doesn't make a lot of sense logically.
Right, yeah. And so the burns that were on Emil's chest were from Didier pushing him up against the fireplace grate, because Didier is a weird psycho who's colonized with pseudomycota and wanting to be close to the flame. The doctor has this weird sort of break during the dinner with the Baron, and the thing that I didn't realize while I was reading the scene, but that I realized later, was that the doctor was having a seizure. This was a problem that its original host body had. And the doctor has a weird conversation with the Baron about, I don't remember. It was really weird and like menacing. But anyway, stuff kind of like flies off the rails at this point. The doctor escapes from the dinner and runs off to find what's happened to Emil. Has lost connection with Emil. Emil's no longer in the doctor's rooms. And so the doctor ends up in Didier's suite, finds Didier like assaulting Emil. Emil and the doctor beat Didier with the fire poker. And they're like, we have to get out of here because suddenly like the Institute has come. Like they come on an airship. I think they couldn't take the train, so they brought an airship instead.
Yeah, they brought a dirigible. And they docked it to the roof of the chateau, I believe.
Conveniently. Yeah, so all hell breaks loose. The Institute doctors are swarming the place at this point. And this was an interesting break. This was an interesting change in perspective, Nico, and I think you had a very particular take on it.
Did I? Well, I felt like this whole, like, let's say, last quarter of the book was a very different tone in general. And it almost felt like a different book. And it, like we were saying before, it's a page turner at this point, but then it stops making a lot of sense. So the doctor is losing control of its body. So the Institute's losing control of this host. And the original host is beginning to emerge again and take back control of her body. And I don't know what prompted so many doctors from the Institute to show up all at once here, if they weren't even in contact with the doctor. Maybe because they've lost contact with two doctors in a row. I guess that could trigger some kind of response. But it really felt like the Institute itself started acting like a completely different character at this point. Because we've been seeing the book through the eyes of the Institute, because that's who the doctor was for the first 2/3 of the book. And now that we've lost control of lost the link to the Institute, now the Doctor is Simone, the original host of the original body, the original person who was in that body. And the Institute shows up and they're just everywhere acting like evil robots. So
yeah,
and
yeah,
we've
they,
seen
they seem very other at this point, which is a weird sort of discontinuity, considering that they had kind of been the point of view character.
Yeah, so the Institute has spent literally its entire existence as the world's doctors, convincing everyone. Nobody knows that the Institute is a parasitic organism. Nobody knows that these aren't just doctors who have taken on a vow of getting rid of their name and doing service over self. They don't know that these people have literally given up their bodies against their will. They think that these are people who are just dedicated to the service. So everyone thinks they're human. And we've spent the first 2/3 of this book interacting with everyone as a human, not letting them know that we're a parasite. And then the last third of the book, the Institute's running around being evil, not human at all creatures. And it's like, what just happened here? Did they just drop all pretense because they're interacting with the Doctor? But there's other people in the chateau that they're being weird around. Like literally robot like there'll be multiple doctors in a room and they'll like stare at the ceiling and be like, oh yes, so I'm talking to the world. And it's just, it didn't make sense in terms of continuity, and it felt a little rushed, honestly. I felt like this could have been done better than it was, and it could have been consistent with the rest of the book. Not that it's bad, it just could have been better.
Yeah, no, I do see that. Like, it didn't necessarily take me out of the book, but it was an interesting contrast. That it seemed like they were sort of, going silent and communicating with the hive mind and coming to consensus and stuff. And it's a very different perspective than you get from the parasite's point of view, where it's, those conversations are happening in its head. And
I felt like the author really wanted to flip it here, and they wanted to be like, okay, so the Institute is the good guy and we're up against pseudomycota, and then it's like, boom, I got you, now the Institute's the bad guy. And it felt a little ham-fisted, because then they're all like acting evil all of a sudden just because now we know they're the bad guy and now they're evil. It's like, no, I didn't buy it.
Yeah, it would have been difficult to kind of start the book from the point of view of a character that you're just supposed to like consider an absolute villain, right? But there are parallels between how the Institute considers its host bodies and how how other institutions in this world are operating and sort of perpetuating abuse and exploitation. There's an interesting passage, and it's a flashback from Simone's childhood, from the Doctor's host body's childhood. And it says, sometimes the TA and I would stay inside our little shack and she would read me books about when the world was far too big. She hid them in the loose floorboards in case anyone from the palace came around to snoop, but at night she'd take out the whole stack. She'd stolen dozens and dozens of tomes when she fled from the collection of palace geeks that called itself Research and Development. It was called so, she told me, for the same reason Inultus's governor was called a governor and Verdira's baron was called the baron. Someone found the word in an old magazine, approximated its meaning, and decided to use it. And I thought that was just a really interesting detail. Sort of they've reemerged from hiding. Humanity's reemerged from hiding, and they're sort of erecting these same old structures, these same old hierarchies, that humanity had going before the apocalypse. And I think that there's a point there that the author was trying to make about these systems of abuse. And so while the Institute may, seem to have had, altruistic impulses in, becoming physicians and tending after humans, and only taking as hosts, humans that had physical problems that probably would have prevented them from living much longer anyway. It's not it's not like a force for good, right? It's still an abusive relationship. It's still an invasive parasite that takes over its host and directs its activities, without letting the host have very much input at all. So, nah. Where are we at now? Oh my goodness.
They just finished off Didier.
They finished up duty. Yeah. The institute comes. They lock down the chateau. They're trying to get a hold on the situation. Simone, who is now completely recovered herself, and Emile need to escape because Simone doesn't want the institute to dissect Emile.
Yeah, they're vivisecting Helene's baby too, which was
the baby. The baby probably had been infected with pseudomycota, despite appearing to have been healthy. So maybe it would not have lived very long anyway. But it's very shocking.
Well, there's something weird going on there too, because we don't know how many months along she was, but it sounded like nowhere near 9 months, and all of a sudden a 9-month-old baby came out of her. So what the hell was going on with pseudomycota in that body? And so that's one thing I think that the doctor had mentioned was like, what was pseudomycota doing in there, and is this a new kind of vessel that it's trying to create or something like that?
Yeah, so they take apart the baby. The twins wake up. Someone has their hair is either fallen out or been shaven off, so they're bald-headed, and they help the doctor in a weird way. They help the doctor break into a room, and it seems like they were able to pass through the wall.
Well, they were saying earlier that some ghost had taught them how to walk through walls. And my interpretation of that was that there were a lot of passages hidden in. I think Emile had mentioned that in one of his flashbacks, or one of the flashbacks the doctor was able to see, was that there were hidden passages and that they had learned about them from Emile. So the doctor's, or Simone rather, is desperately trying to lockpick, and it's been so long since Simone has had control of her body that she used to be kind of a thief and scavenger, so she knew how to lockpick, but it's been so long she didn't remember how to do it very well, and she didn't have the manual dexterity for it anymore. And so she's fumbling with it and fumbling with it and fumbling with it, and the twins are like, what are you trying to do? And she's like, I'm trying to get in this room. And then so one of them disappears and opens the door from the other side. It's like, oh, okay, that works.
An interesting side note is that earlier in the book, the twins had been complained of seeing ghosts and stuff, and they said that Emile had been helping them place talismans in different, little hidey holes around the chateau, in order to ward off the ghosts. And it turns out that the talismans were actually explosives, that Emile had been nicking explosives from Baker, and had planned to burn the chateau down, which, hey, cool, we're, Simone's on board with this.
Sorry, I don't understand.
Nobody asked you, Google. Yeah, so they kill the Baron. It takes a couple of headshots. He's a tough old bastard. They finish off Didier. He was in pretty bad shape, but they finished the job. They burn the chateau down, and the dirigible, which had been parked on the roof of the chateau, also explodes. Massive destruction.
There must have been using hydrogen like the Hindenburg.
Yeah,
because it explodes quite dramatically, and basically
the humanity.
the chateau is like reduced to a cloud of splinters. I remember this whole sequence of events being very vividly described.
Yeah, it was really something.
Simone and Emile basically scramble out of a window and flounder across the snow trying to get away, and they turn around and everything just goes. So
they're running away from the explosion.
Yeah,
like a movie, like a movie trailer.
And because this explosion is so hot, all of the pseudomycota in the area is attracted to it. So they're trying to run away, and all the pseudomycota is like skittering across the snow past them towards the fire, which is just like, ew, gross. So
hopefully everyone died. You yikes. Yeah, this is it was a pretty incredible scene, and Simone and Emil spend a couple of days sort of fleeing through the ice and the snow and the ruins of, this dead civilization. They have an encounter with the Ventigo, which they survive somehow. Simone apparently had a seizure during it, but Emil got her away.
They find the sled dog again.
They find the dog again. And the dog travels with them and helps them get through the snow and stuff. The dog is a very good girl. They are headed for the train. They're going to get on the train. Simone is, planning to, go and see her family again. They get sort of to the edge of the forest, and the dog stops. It won't go any further. And Simone eventually persuades Emil, just to leave it behind. We
Which
have to go.
I thought was very curious. What plot point do you think that means? Why does the dog not want to go?
So I think the dog didn't want to go. There's an old legend that Priest alludes to about, if you're born in Verdera, you die in Verdera. That's just how it works. And this dog is a Montish dog, and Emil is a Montish person. And I think the dog just its instinct told it not to leave that area. There's a story that Priest tells about Emil's mother, Utali, about how he tried to help her escape. She had plans to, burn down the chateau because, she didn't really appreciate, her and her people being exploited by the Baron. And so she had to try and leave town, and Priest tried to help her. And the further south they got, the worse her health seemed to be. She was pregnant at the time, and she gets to a point where she just starts crying uncontrollably. She's crying all of the water out of her body. And Priest, typically his stories are very hyperbolic and sort of, folksy in that way. And, he basically says, that he helped her have her child by cesarean section, and that she, basically dried up and blew away on the wind immediately because she was so dehydrated. It sort of chalks this up to, it's this belief that if you're born in Verdera, you die in Verdera. And so I think the dog was right. I think Emil should have stayed with the dog. But Emil and Simone find the train. They hop on the train like old-timey hobos. Simone sees the child from the beginning of the story, the child from the train who she traded gloves with, who has chewed out the finger of the new gloves. And I thought that was kind of a fun little bookend to the story. But Simone and Emil are on the train car, and Emil throws the door open at one point and is gazing back at the mountains and turns back to Simone, and she sees that he's crying. And that's kind of where the story ends. And I think that it was ambiguous, but this being a Gothic story that very much leans hard into the Gothic tropes, I think Emil was doomed. I think he was about to die.
Well, I was wondering if there was almost a larger allegory or subtext or something going on in the last half of this book, because the Doctor actually names Pseudomycota Emil, which I thought was very rude at first. It's because Emil discovered her or whatever. But this whole, after we do the link with Emil and we start seeing into his memories and everything, there seems to be a lot more going on under the surface there. And there's a reference to Emil losing control of himself as a result of the abuse. And the line in the book is, "You had mastered the art of stepping outside yourself, of removing Emil and letting someone else slip into his place." So is this whole thing actually an allegory for having to separate, to compartmentalize yourself as a result of abuse? Do you think that's what the author was going for there in terms of naming it Pseudomycota Emil and then having this whole abuse sub-story going on?
I don't know. That's an interesting angle that I hadn't really thought about. I mean, obviously Emil gets revenge. That's interesting. It is interesting because the Modish people were said to have survived like in the caves in the mountains for so long, and that's where Pseudomycota was discovered, was in the mine, like under the ground. I don't know. That is interesting. I remembered the thing that I wanted to talk about during the sequence where Simone and Emil are fleeing through the snow, which is that Simone basically takes responsibility for and apologizes to Emil for trying to infect him with the Institute while still under the influence of said Institute. And I thought like that was the big moment in the book. That I did this without your knowledge or consent, and I apologize to you. That was wrong.
Well, consent is kind of an issue in the whole book, because like the Institute itself is just like a mess of consent issues, which kind of culminates with the doctor's Simone's clear discomfort with the doctor attempting to infect Emil. Which could have been a sign that Simone was starting to take control again, but it's also Emil's infection was self-serving. It wasn't under any sort of contract like a lot of the other ones that the book described. Like Simone's contract was because Simone had suffered a pretty severe head injury, and that caused the epilepsy and the seizures. And my understanding was that Simone probably wasn't going to live all that long. And so Simone's mother's made this contract with the Institute saying, okay, Simone will join the doctor. She will forsake her name and lose herself. I think that I have that wording in here somewhere, the exact wording that they described, but the service before self thing. They'll forsake their name. You will never speak to Simone again. Simone will be gone, but this body will thrive under our care, and Simone will become a doctor and help others. And so they agreed that was a better situation than Simone was going to be in, dealing with the head injury and the seizures. And so that's like there's consent there, but they weren't actually told the whole story. It was not informed consent. You have that angle, and then Emil has none of that. Emil is literally drugged, strapped down, and injected with the shit. Right. And then you have Pseudomycota, which just chases everyone down and forces itself on them. Like, so whether it's sentient or not, I think we're going to get into that, but there's no consent there whatsoever. People are literally running and screaming from it, and it's chasing them down. So there's no consent, but that's what a good pathogen will do, right? No matter how much you tell it, you do not consent to being infected. It's going to infect you. But then there's also these themes of sexual assault throughout the book that are most certainly not consented to. And then there's the sequence where the doctor is force-fed alcohol against its consent by Helene, and then eventually just starts to gives up and enjoys the alcohol, and ends up with a massive hangover for the whole miscarriage scene. So it's like, I don't actually, that made me raise an eyebrow for sure. I was like, is this supposed to be good that you're enjoying it now? I don't know what's going on here. So like, I don't know if that was an intended theme or what was going on there.
So do you think Pseudomycota is sentient?
That I'm not sure about. So I've flagged a couple of lines from the book to kind of dig into it a little bit. So it seems to have very basic instincts, like it's drawn to heat. Its hosts didn't really have any indications of sentience. Like they didn't seem to change their personality the way that the Institute changes their personality. Like the Institute is basically speaking through the bodies. Pseudomycota doesn't do any of that. It's just, it makes you want to get close to heat, basically, which is more cordyceps-like than what the Institute is doing. But then there's a couple snips from the book. This was talking about the past, like the former Earth and science and stuff. And it says, she showed me pictures of what we built to emulate those things. Swarms of metal bees spilling across the sky. Vats of semi-conscious liquids bubbling in agony. A township-sized, ultimately harmless mold that did nothing but wander from one end of the continent to the other, muttering to itself. She showed me the tools we built to send them into the sky. So that suggests that they have labs full of literal vats of semi-conscious liquids I have no idea what the fuck they're doing with these semi-conscious liquids, because it talks a little bit about slime molds. Slime molds are something I've actually done research into, and they're super fucking awesome. But Physarum polycephalum, which means many-headed slime mold, it's literally a blob of orange slime. And it sticks out tendrils, which is what this book, the descriptions of Pseudomycota, reminds me of. It sticks out tendrils and it finds food sources, and then it builds networks between them. And it's incredibly efficient. They've mapped it over the Japanese rail system, and it was able to find the most, which the Japanese rail system is supposed to be one of the most efficient ones in the world, right? So they gave it the map, and it mapped it out in exactly the same way. Like, it found the most efficient routes and basically created a rail network that was identical to the super efficient Japanese network. And I was like, whoa, look at this. But really, that's not, I don't think that's that difficult of a task. There's food where all the major centers of the city would have been. So it put networks between them in exactly the way that exactly the way the Japanese people did, right? But it's also, the Physarum polycephalum has also displayed elements of being able to make choices, which I thought was fucking awesome. They described it, I'm going to mess this up because I don't have the research article in front of me, but they described it as being equivalent to when people go to a restaurant and they're given a choice between wine bottles. So they gave the Physarum a choice between food. It's light phobic. It gets hurt by sunlight or radiation from UV, so it likes to be in the dark. So they gave it a pile of food that was like really good. Like, there's a lot of nutrients in the food out in the light, and then there's kind of a shitty pile of food in the dark where it wants to be. And it would make value judgments. And they compared it to people ordering wine bottles at a restaurant. And they actually got it to choose the one that you would not expect it to choose by giving it a comparison. So if you're at a restaurant and there's like a $10 bottle of wine and a $100 bottle of wine, you're probably going to get the $10 bottle of wine. But if there's a $10 bottle of wine and a $100 bottle of wine and a $10,000 bottle of wine, you might be like, oh, the $100 bottle of wine isn't that bad, so I'm going to go for that and splurge a little bit. And the slime mold did the exact same thing. When it was given a choice of like something that's absolutely ridiculous, you would never do it, it made the other one seem okay, and it made more networks to that one, which I thought was crazy. And again, I've probably, if anyone's listening to this and they actually know those in more detail than me, they're going to be like, nah, this is wrong. But that was kind of the gist of it. Like, it made the choice that you would not expect if you're going purely for efficiency. But my research was into conditioning. So they actually got them to respond to conditioning signals. So conditioning is like stimulus response. And they got it to, I didn't do this. The research I was basing my research on was this. They got it to respond to, it doesn't like cold either, because it's a liquid, basically. So if it gets really cold, it slows down. So it wants to avoid that. And they got it to respond to temperature changes. When it's really cold, it goes into like a capsule state to protect itself. And they gave it really regular temperature changes, and it started anticipating them and going into a capsule state before the temperature changed. And so the big debate when that first came out was, well, it can't be responding to conditioning because it doesn't have a neural network. It doesn't have a brain. And my argument was, well, you're arguing that it doesn't have a brain and not that the conditioning could be a cellular process. Like, maybe you don't need a brain to have conditioning. And people were trying to recreate it in like electrical transistors and stuff. They say, see, these aren't alive, and they were able to do the same thing. But that doesn't, I don't think that's an argument either. So even though it's not organic, it's responding to conditioning. That means that conditioning could be an electrical response. Anyway, that was a long digression. But they're creating these semi-conscious liquids, and they never explain what they're doing with these things, but they've created slime molds that wander from one end of a continent to another, muttering to itself, so they can essentially speak. I was like, what the fuck is going on in this book? So, like, what are they doing with these slime molds is what I want to know.
Yeah. And what if those slime molds escape into the wild and are allowed to reproduce or mutate in uncontrolled situations, like where do you end up?
Township-sized slime mold that can walk across a continent. Why did you create this, and what are you going to do with it?
Yeah, what did you think was going to happen? They never stopped to ask if they should.
Basically.
The doctor, the institute does sort of spend a little bit of time in the book reflecting on its own evolution, and sort of talks about going from a state where it was sort of passed, from host to host without any, intention or direction, just by happenstance, and kind of slowly developed awareness and slowly kind of came around and evolved alongside the humans who are sort of reemerging and reconstructing civilization. And so it could be that Pseudomycota is in a similar early stage of its evolution. So maybe it's not quite sentient, but it could get there.
But it also says vats of semi-conscious liquids bubbling in agony. So if it's semi-conscious, but it can feel agony, that suggests that it's fairly...
Can you feel agony without a brain?
Wow, boy, if we could answer that question. Because they would argue there's no pain receptors, you can't feel pain, but they also thought that babies couldn't feel pain because they went silent.
I was going to say, yeah, they used to say that babies and fish couldn't feel pain, so... My baby only felt pain.
Oh.
My baby had no emotions other than anger or being asleep for the first probably 4 months. Bad memories. So I want to talk about what we learned from this book. We learned some amazing vocabulary.
Yeah, I have a list of vocabulary words. So I didn't even include the medical terminology, which there's a lot of medical terminology in this book that I basically, every time I came across a big fancy word, I was like, ooh, and I highlighted it. But not including the medical terminology, there is, of course, your favorite word, rubicund.
Rubicund. I feel like we talked about this a little bit. I feel like you get to use that word like once in a book. But this word is in the book, like, we counted. Was it like 7 times?
Editor's note. The word rubicund actually appears in the text 3 times. Please forgive the host, because you have to admit this is the kind of word that really chews up the scenery.
It was in the book a lot. This is a book that means like ruddy, or this is the word that means
ruddy.
I
was like, right. When I read it the first time, I was like, doesn't that mean ruddy? And then I looked it up, and the definition is literally the difference between rubicund and ruddy is that rubicund is ruddy, while ruddy is red. So it's like, okay.
It's such a delicious word, though. Yeah. I mean,
but then there's more words that I highlight. So there's braggadocious, which means to be boastful or arrogant. There's infelicitous, which is unfortunate or inappropriate. There's salubrious, which is health-giving or healthy. And see, I knew lugubrious. I didn't actually know salubrious. I didn't realize there was a reverse of lugubrious. It doesn't sound healthy. It sounds disgusting, doesn't it? Salubrious.
It does. It makes me think of like secretion.
Yeah, like lubrious sounds like lubrication, like bleh, bleh. But it's health-giving. It's healthy. Then there's a dehisced. I might be saying that wrong, but that's to gape or burst open, like a pod or seed vessel or a cut or a wound, which is more likely the context for this book. Couleurs, which is a French word, of course, because there's a lot of French, sort of like mutated French in this book. Like they say adieu, or they say dieu instead of adieu for goodbye, and they say jour instead of bonjour for hello. So couleurs was a narrow gully with a steep gradient and a mountainous terrain. And that word came up a lot too, because I highlighted it, I think 3 times, because I was like, oh, there's a new word. And I was like, no, that word sounds familiar. It came up a few times.
Wow, Nico, it's so great to be here several days in the past with you, continuing to have the conversation that we were having, and not we didn't lose it in a podcast audio related mishap. So yes, I believe you were at Massif.
Massif is a section of a planet's crust that is demarcated by faults or flexures. So there's a lot of like geography terms in here that I wasn't that familiar with, but anyone who's familiar with geography would be like, yeah, so. And then there was palimpsest, which is like one of my new favorite words. It's a manuscript or piece of writing material on which the original writing has been effaced to make room for later writing, but of which traces remain. And the craziest thing about this word is I read this word in this book and was like, palimpsest. Oh, I really like this word. And I've started reading our next book. And in that book, they have palimp screens. And I'm like, okay, so is this just a super common word that I've just glazed right over? And I actually see it like everywhere all the time. So
anyway. Palimpsest confirmation bias now.
Yes, I totally am. But I still like that word. So palimpsest and palim screens for the future. And then there were domains, land attached to manors and retained for the owner's use. And there were girandoles, a branched support for candles or other lights, which either stands on a surface or projects from a wall. So all of that is just very Victorian words. And then there were lots of words that I kind of knew, like carceral, which is of, relating to, or suggesting jail or prison. Of course, incarcerated is a very common word, but carceral is a usage of it that I don't think I was that familiar with. Capricious, which is given to sudden and unaccountable changes of mood or behavior. Divaricating, which is branching or having separation or a degree of separation. Like I knew diverging, I knew diverticulating, but I somehow didn't really know divaricating. And then, of course, there's tons of medical terminology, which might be intimidating to some readers. There were quite a few that I didn't even highlight in my list, but I highlighted postical, which is a period that begins when a seizure subsides and ends when the patient returns to baseline. There's trabeculated, when something blocks the urethra, like a kidney stone, can slow down or stop urine from getting out, and your bladder walls must work harder as your bladder tries to force out the urine. That causes the bladder walls to thicken, and the thickening is called trabeculation. Now, that is another one of my favorite words that I will probably not encounter frequently and will probably never have a chance to use, but I just like the way it sounded. And then there was the bistoury, which is a surgical knife that is used a lot in this book for some reason. So
that's such a wonderful, it's such a wonderful word, bistoury. It's such a wonderful word because even if you don't know what it means in context, you can kind of guess, and it sounds really mean. It sounds like a bad thing.
See, I think it sounds like bistro, so I don't know how mean it sounds. And I've also probably totally butchered the pronunciation of everything, so
it's fine.
I read things, I don't talk.
Exactly. We're readers on this podcast. We don't talk to each other, so we don't hear the words, we see them with our eyeballs. We're still technically in the what did we learn portion of the podcast. So was there anything else that you wanted to share that you learned other than lots of nice vocabulary?
I don't know that there was anything more than the vocabulary that I learned. What have I learned? What did you learn?
I learned that I'm not sure I would still like my doctor if they were a worm.
Mm-hmm. I learned that Montish men can breastfeed.
That is an interesting little tidbit there. Yeah.
And I was curious if that means that the Montish men can breastfeed because this is the future in this book and things might have changed or we might have evolved in some way, or like it is possible for men to lactate. It's just not very common. Or if it's because the Montish people are mentioned as they don't have very strict gender roles. So maybe the lactating men in these stories were actually female and we're actually breastfeeding. So I'm curious about that angle, but this book doesn't really go into it.
Yeah, that's a little tidbit that comes out. It's about Priest, the folk healer, that he breastfeeds Utali's baby when he's on the way back to Verdira. And they mentioned that he had formerly ample breasts. Is that what they said? I can't remember exactly.
I can pull it. I do have my Kindle here. Ah, here it is. It had been years since his formerly abundant breasts.
Abundant. That was the word.
Which makes sense because it's abundant because it's producing lots of milk.
And it does. You could have ample breasts without producing milk, right? Plenty of people do. So, that was an interesting little tidbit that kind of sailed over my head the first time, and I think you mentioned it in email, and I was like, wait a minute, what? I'm just finishing up a reread on audio. The audiobook for this is pretty good, by the way. And it definitely stood out to me on the audiobook too. I was like, oh, okay. That's an interesting little note. So either Montish men are, fully capable lactators, or it's possible that Priest was a trans man, or, I mean, it's wide open. It's post-apocalyptic future, and humanity has mutated. And I mean, who's to say that people even really look very much like they do today? I mean, obviously, most of them don't have tails. Otherwise, that wouldn't have been such a notable thing about Emil and his mother. But
I was thinking a bit about that book by Anne Leckie. What was the name of that book? But all the pronouns didn't matter in that book at all. Mm-hmm. So it could be that Priest is female and just goes by he, and not necessarily trans, but could also be trans.
Good point. Ancillary Justice is the book you're thinking of. Now I got to add that to the show notes. Gosh darn it. I think we both definitely really enjoyed and would recommend this book, maybe to non-sensitive readers. You have to be prepared for some body horror. Let's talk about recommendations or books that we also like that have some similarities. The top of my list in terms of modern Gothic fiction is We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. Of course, Shirley Jackson is a modern master, and is probably one of her better known books is The Haunting of Hill House. But I think that We Have Always Lived in the Castle is more accessible. It's certainly more straightforward, and just a really, really good read. And there was a really great film adaptation of it made just a few years ago that is well worth checking out. I'd also recommend, in terms of modern Gothic, the new novel, What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher, which is the pen name of Ursula Vernon. What Moves the Dead is a retelling of Edgar Allan Poe's Fall of the House of Usher. And this is definitely a good choice if you like lots of fungal hyphae in your fiction. 2 thumbs up on that. Another modern retelling of Fall of the House of Usher is the television program The Haunting of Bly Manor on Netflix. And maybe folks are more familiar with that. And another one I wanted to toss out is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. It does what it says on the tin. Again, it's super Gothic, super dark, super fun. And I think if you like LEECH, you would probably also like Mexican Gothic, and vice versa. Nico, what are your recommendations?
Well, for someone who's looking for something similar, like kind of in tone and in world, I recommend the Locked Tomb series by Tamsyn Muir, starting with Gideon the Ninth. I just feel like it had just a similar feel. So if you kind of want to get into a world that is similar to this, but not maybe as gross, I think that one's a good one to explore. And this book reminded me of a lot of different things. I felt like it had shades of like a lot of different works, but none of these I would say are exactly like if you wanted to get something that's very similar, but they all have little elements. So if there's one element of it that you particularly like, there might be some different avenues to explore. So Frankenstein, obviously anything Victorian kind of takes you back to Frankenstein, and just the description of the chateau was just like, okay, that's Frankenstein's castle back there. And I originally mentioned BLOODBORNE, which is not a great recommendation for book readers at all, because for one, it's a video game, and for two, the narrative in that game is actually pretty well buried. You have to really dig into the world and find the story. It doesn't give it to you at all. And also the game itself is fairly difficult. It's famously difficult to play. So it's not a great one for someone to be like, I'm going to go play this game and learn the story if you read books. But if you like the Victorian style setting and just the general fucked upness, a game where the good ending is you turning into a slug seems like a good recommendation for just this kind of atmosphere. And I felt like the way the Institute works in this book reminded me a lot of The Witcher. So in The Witcher, you have there's horrible monsters that are causing problems. So they have the Witchers and they come and kill them. Much like in this world, people get sick and they have pathogens or whatever else, and then they call in the Institute to come and deal with it. And just like in The Witcher, the Witcher has to go through a conversion ritual to be able to handle the toxins and everything for the tools that they use to defeat the monsters. And that's basically stealing the life of a child and turning them into a Witcher forevermore. So nobody really wants to become a Witcher, but as payment for killing some horrible monster, they might take a child. And that kind of reminded me how the Institute in this book is working, where they come and heal you as a doctor, they save someone's life, and in return, you have to either give a body to them or a child or in some way. And that's how the Institute propagates, basically. So I felt like there was a parallel there, but the actual stories and worlds are quite different. But because the doctor is addicted to analgesics, I thought that was very Sherlock Holmes, running around solving medical mysteries while high. We mentioned Year Walk at one point. The only thing that really reminds me about this in Year Walk is that the sort of main antagonist character is something that looks very similar to a Ventigo as described in this book. But in general weirdness and messed upness, Year Walk is a very good short little game. Again, that's a game, not a book, but I think it's worth everyone's time to investigate that game. And we both mentioned The Thing, because the sled dog becomes infected with a parasite, but the tone is a little bit different there too. And the way that this features an airborne pathogen really reminded me of Blood Music by Greg Bear, which is an incredibly good book. If you like the infection angle of everything, that one is definitely worth your time. I really hated the ending of it, but the rest of it was a great read. And because the moon explodes in this, it really reminded me of Seven Eves, which is a Neil Stephenson book about the moon exploding. And I feel like Stephenson would have a lot to say about the way that the moon exploding is described in this book, because that book is exhaustively researched. It's not even a story. It's like a documentary about what would happen if the moon exploded. And it kind of fails to put a narrative in there. But it's very, very accurate. So if you want to see what would actually happen if the moon exploded, you can read that. I don't know that I recommend it as a book, but it was had a lot of interesting facts in it, at least.
It's so funny because it has a lot of interesting facts, but I'm not sure it has a narrative as a description of an awful lot of Neil Stephenson books. I hate to say it. I've enjoyed some of his work, but
And I think we both compared it a little bit to various kinds of anime that's out there, like Princess Mononoke or whatever. And just, I can see this book being animated in an anime style with just the descriptions of the slimy black blood and the bulging eyeballs and the Ventigo being kind of forest god-like. It just kind of felt like that's how it was playing out in my head.
Yeah, so. It's got big Junji Ito vibes, I think, if you've ever read any of his horror manga.
Is that the Animar Vault? The hole was meant for me guy?
I think so.
I don't know the name. Animiga Vault or something. Oh, someone's going to hear this and be like, oh my God, these people. So our recording says we've recorded 9 seconds so far. Is it?
No, that can't be right. Don't tell me that. No, I see 17 minutes and 5 seconds.
Okay.
But it lied to me last time.
Well, hopefully I recorded my side for more than 20 seconds.
If it fails to record the end of this podcast twice in a row, I think that's just a sign from the universe.
This is Pseudomycota.
Pseudomycota wants to stop this podcast. I'm being a nerd now. I wanna see a list of all of Junji Ito's works. Probably don't have to do this right this minute. I read one of his books recently. What was it? Censor?
I saw his name in one of the in the book lists you sent me.
Okay, yeah, I'll leave this tab up and I'll come back to it later. Okay. Good talk, good chat that we definitely finished several days in the past. I'm going to move on to our concluding words. You can follow us on Twitter at RobotElfBCPod, assuming that the site is available and is still in operation. Who knows? Shrug. You can follow us on YouTube. Look for Robot Elf Book Club. You can follow us on Tumblr. Remember that website? Search for Robot Elf Book Club.
We're going to have a MySpace at this rate.
We might have a MySpace. We might have a TikTok. We might. We'll never have a Facebook, folks. I hate to disappoint. Yeah. We'll move to any and every social media platform that isn't being run by an Emerald Mine failson. So
maybe we'll have a subreddit.
Ooh, there's an idea. Thank you all so much for listening. We really appreciate your support. If you would like to read along with us, in December, we'll be back to discuss The Mountain in the Sea by Ray Naylor. We'll see you next time.